In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create a basic looping animation, create procedural materials, and render everything out using cycles. And as always, all the keys I'm pressing will be showing in the bottom right corner of my screen. So first I'm going to delete the default cube, followed by Shift-A to create a new cylinder. I'm going to set the number of vertices to 64 for a smoother shape. I will then tab into the edit mode, press R, Y, and 90 to rotate on the y-axis by 90 degrees, followed by G for move tool, Z for z-axis, and 1 for 1 meter. Now, tabbing out of the edit mode and looking at my model, I can still see sharp edges, so I'm going to right click on my model and select Shade Smooth. Now I do want some edges to remain sharp, so I'm going to go to Object Data Properties tab, and under Normals, select Auto Smooth. This will ensure that every angle sharper than the default setting of 30 degrees is going to remain sharp. And here's the base for the endless mortadella stick. To properly arrange my future scene, I need to set up a camera. I will start by adding a dedicated 3D viewport. To add a new viewport, I will drag that little rounded corner in the bottom right, then click on the icon in the top left corner and select 3D viewport. Now I still have the default camera in my scene, so I might as well use it. I'm going to move the cursor over the newly created viewport and press numpad 0 for camera view. Since I want to end up with a square video, I'm going to go to the Output Properties tab and make sure that my X resolution is the same as Y resolution. Now that my scene has the correct dimensions, I can properly position the camera. To make it easier, I will first enable the Move gizmo. By default, the axes of my gizmo are aligned with the world, so I'm going to go to Transform Orientations and set it to Local instead. This will give me much better context for moving the camera, so I'll drag it around until the end of the cylinder is roughly in the center of my scene. Now let's put our mortadella on a cutting board. I'll press Shift-A to create a cube, tab into the edit mode, and type G, Z, and -1 to move it 1 meter down. Then I'll type in S and Y to scale it on the y-axis. And then I'll pan around my model, press 3 for face select mode, and drag the rear face all the way back. The goal is to move it past the camera viewport. And finally, let's adjust the thickness. To do that, I'll simply move the bottom face up. The board is pretty much ready. Let's just add one final touch. I'm going to press 2 for edge select mode, A to select all edges, and Ctrl B to add some bevel. I will scroll my mouse wheel up to give my bevel 3 segments. Now let's tab out of the edit mode, right click on the cutting board, and select Shade Smooth. The last model we're going to create will be the backdrop. I'm going to press Shift-A and go for UV sphere. Then I'm going to scale it to about 20 meters to cover the entire scene, followed by R, Y, and 90 to rotate it by 90 degrees on the y-axis. Then tab into the edit mode, press 1 for vertex select, and select the vertex at the pole. Press Ctrl numpad plus until half of my sphere is selected. I will then press delete and select faces. And finally, I will tab out of the edit mode, right click, and shade the hemisphere smooth. At this point, the bulk of our modeling is done. The only final touch would be extending the cylinder so that its rear end is not visible in the camera viewport. Now that we're basically done with our modeling, let's work on the lighting. But first I'm going to hover over the camera viewport, press Z and select Rendered. Now we can actually see the lighting in our scene. Most of the light is actually coming from that default point light, which I'm going to reuse. In this case, it's going to be easier to position it using global coordinates. So I'm going to switch to global and position the light slightly above and to the left of the mortadella. Now the shadow on the other side is too dark. So let's put another light there to balance it out and give the mortadella shape a bit more definition. So with Shift A, I'm going to add an area light. Then in the new lights properties, I'm going to set the power to 700. Then I'm going to move my light to the edge of the cutting board. Scale it on the x-axis a little bit. Rotate it to face the mortadella. And move it up until I see the light bleed over the top of the mortadella a tiny bit. And now, thanks to the light and shadow, our shape is a lot better defined. The last light we're going to add is going to be the ambient light from the environment. For that, we're going to use an HDR environment texture that ships with Blender itself. To activate it, I'm going to go to the world settings and under color select environment texture. And in response, the whole scene will turn fuchsia pink. This is to tell us that we need to select the actual image texture. So I'm going to click open and navigate to Interior EXR in my Blender installation directory. And here's my ambient lighting. The last thing I'm going to do is to decrease the intensity to 0.5. And my lighting is pretty much done. And of course I can always come back and make adjustments later. With our modeling and lighting out of the way, let's work on the materials. We'll start with the easy ones first. I'm going to select the background object, scroll down to the Materials tab, and click New to create a new material. I'm going to name it BG for background. And for base color, paste this hex value I picked earlier. Next, I'm going to create mortadella casing material. I'm going to select the cylinder, go to Materials tab, and in it create a new material called casing. For the base color, I have another pre-picked hex value. And in this case, I'm also going to bring down roughness to make the casing shinier. The next material I'm going to create is wood for the cutting board. I will select my cutting board and in the Materials tab, create a new material called wood. In the case of my simpler materials, I would just edit the material properties down here. But this material is too complex for that, so I'm going to repurpose my main viewport as shader editor. Its node-based system can seem a bit intimidating at first, but we will go step by step, which should make it a bit easier to digest. Before I begin, I wanted to give credit to Ducky3D, whose procedural wood tutorial this is based on. I'm going to put a link to his great tutorial channel in the description. So, creating procedural textures is all about mixing and tweaking things in creative ways. In our case, we're going to use a simple procedural noise texture as a starting point. So I'm going to press Shift A and under Textures, select Noise Texture. Then I'm going to connect the factor output to the base color of our material. And here's the first result. Looking at it a bit closer, I'm noticing that the material got applied pretty unevenly. To address that, I'm going to press Shift A and under Input, select Texture Coordinate. Now if I connect the object output of this node to the vector input of noise texture, the texture will wrap evenly around my object. Now this looks more like some kind of stone than wood. So as a next step, I'm going to press Shift A, select Mapping node under Vector, and drop it behind the noise texture. Now I can adjust the tiling of the texture on the y-axis, which will make it look a bit more like wood grain. Now looking at the pattern closer, I find it to be too fine for wood. To address that, I can dial down the scale on the noise texture. Now this is a bit better, but it's missing the slight swirliness of the wood grain. Luckily the noise texture has just the right setting to help us address that. Look what happens when I dial up distortion. Since in this tutorial we're not after photorealism, I'm going to call this pattern convincing enough for our purposes. By now you must have noticed that our wood is actually black and white, so let's add some color. Actually, 2 colors to be exact. So I'm going to press Shift A and under Color select Mix RGB. This node comes with 2 color slots. We're going to use Color 1 and Color 2 to represent the darker and the lighter parts of our wood grain. As always, I pre-selected the colors, but you're free to experiment. The final step is to connect the factor of the noise texture with the factor input of the mix node, and then the color of the mix node to the base color of the shader. So as a result, the black parts of the noise texture cause more of color 1 to be applied, and the white parts drive color 2. And this completes our wood material. The last material we're going to make is mortadella itself. I'm going to tab into the edit mode in my 3D viewport, and then shift select the front and back faces of the mortadella. Then I'm going to bring it back to the camera view with numpad 0. Next, I'll create a new material slot, and inside it a new material which I'm going to call mortadella. I will assign my new material to the selected faces, and now I'm ready to go back to the shader editor. I'm going to go with Voronoi texture as the base of my material. This is starting to look right, but it needs a lot more contrast. I'm going to adjust that with the color ramp node. As I move the handles closer together, the contrast starts to increase. So I'm going to play with the positioning of the handles a little bit until the pattern looks right. I can also tweak it a little bit by adjusting the scale of the texture. And now, just like in the wood material, I want to use the resulting pattern to drive the real colors. First, I'll create a Mix RGB node. Then set color 2 to pink and color 1 to white. And connect the nodes to get the final result. All our materials are finally done. Before we proceed with animating, let's tweak the lights a little bit. I'm going to go back to 3D viewport, select the area light and move it back a little bit. I'm also going to scale it up on the x-axis and move it down just a tiny bit. Let us also slightly dim the world light. At this point I'm happy with lights and materials and I'm ready to animate. Now in order to create a slicing animation I need to do some prep work. First I'm going to select the mortadella, press Shift D to make a copy of it and right click to keep it in place. Then I'm going to move the copy in front, zoom out and scale it on the x-axis. I'm going to keep scaling it until it becomes a really thin slice. When I'm done scaling, I'm going to enable snapping and set it to edge. Then I'm going to hover with the cursor over the edge of the mortadella until they snap together seamlessly. I will then disable snapping, make a copy of the slice, move it to the front, and scale it on the x-axis to make it thicker. And finally, I'm going to snap it to the outer edge of the thinner slice. Now during the animation, the thin slice needs to be able to disappear, as if cut away by an invisible knife. To make this possible, I'm going to first create a cube, scale it up so that it's bigger than the mortadella diameter, then go to its object properties, scroll all the way down and set the viewport display to bounds. Then I'm going to select the thin slice, go to the modifiers tab, and add the Boolean modifier. As the object, we're going to pick the cube we just created. And right away you can see that the thin slice disappears within the volume of the cube. You can probably already see where this is going. One last thing I'm going to do before we start animating is tab into the edit mode, enable snapping, and align the front face of the cube with the outer edge of the thick slice. Now let's go to Output Properties and set the parameters of our animation. I'm going to set the frame rate to 30 and the number of frames to 45. This should give me a second and a half of animation. And finally, I'm going to zoom in on the timeline editor to be able to see the keyframes I'm going to add. So let's animate the cutting action. First, I'm going to make sure that I'm in frame 1 and my cutting cube is selected. Then I'm going to press I to create a location keyframe. Now I want my cutting animation to be 20 frames long. So I'm going to move the playhead to frame 20, move my cutting cube to its bottom position, and press I again to add another location keyframe. And now I can drag the playhead back and forth to test the result. Now that we have a cutting animation, we can also animate the slice falling off. I like these animations to have a bit of an overlap, so I'm going to start the slice animation on frame 15. First I'm going to select the slice, then press I and select location and rotation. I will then move the playhead to frame 35, rotate the slice to about 90 degrees, and move it down about this much. And now I can set another location and rotation keyframe. We can even test what we've got so far by dragging the playhead back and forth. Now let's press spacebar to test our animation loop. It looks like it's almost there, except it's a bit jerky. The jerkiness is caused by the mortadella sticking out further in the first frame than in the last. Luckily, this is very easy to fix. Let's press Z and switch to wireframe view. Then numpad 1 for the side view. Let's also zoom in for precision. Select our mortadella and move the playhead to frame 35. Let's add a location keyframe over here. Then let's proceed to the end of the animation. Move our mortadella to the position of the cutoff slice and add the second location keyframe here. Let's press spacebar to test out our animation. And it looks like it's working properly. Now the only thing that's left is rendering everything out. In this last portion of the tutorial, let's review the render settings. I will start in Render Properties tab by selecting Cycles Render Engine. And here it is, trying to render the invisible cube we used in the Boolean operation. Luckily it is an easy fix. Let's click on the funnel icon and turn on Disable in Renders. Now we can finally turn it off for good. Next I'm going to enable GPU rendering, adaptive sampling, both types of denoising. Then I will enable motion blur. And under color management, select very high contrast look. Then in the output properties tab, I'm going to set the folder and file name for my new video. After which I'm going to set the format to ffmpeg and encoding to mpeg4. And after all that, I'm finally ready to render my animation. Cycles rendering usually takes a while, so I'm just going to fast forward to the final result. And here you have it. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and learned something new. I would very much appreciate your comments, and if you'd like more of these tutorials, please like and subscribe.